Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Le Chêne, blurring the streetlights into smeared streaks of gold and bruised purple. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of seared wagyu, truffles, and the powdery, suffocating perfume of the woman sitting across from Adrian. Her name was Diane, or maybe Daphne. He wasn't really listening. Adrian swirled the heavy crystal glass in his hand. The Bordeaux inside caught the dim candlelight, looking exactly like blood. He took a sip. It tasted like battery acid. He turned his head toward the window to escape the drone of Daphne's voice. She was talking about a gallery opening in Soho, something about postmodern decay. That was when he saw her, Celine. She was standing on the corner of 54th and Lexington, waiting for the walk signal. She didn't have an umbrella. The drizzle was plastering her dark hair to her cheeks, ruining the expensive keratin treatments she used to spend hours maintaining. She was wearing a faded olive green trench coat that Adrian had never seen, the belt tied haphazardly, loose threads hanging off the hem. Adrian's grip tightened on the stem of his wine glass. The sharp, cold edge of the crystal dug into his thumb. For 5 years, she had been Celine Pendleton, his wife. 5 years of perfectly tailored pencil skirts, muted beige cashmere, and a posture so rigidly perfect it made his own spine ache. 5 years of a quiet, suffocating elegance that ended 8 months ago with the dry scratch of a fountain pen on divorce papers. He watched her, a cynical sneer instinctively pulling at the corner of his mouth. Look at her, reduced to standing in the rain like a common pedestrian. Then the man stepped into the frame. He was tall but poorly postured, wearing a mustard yellow beanie and a bulky, horrific wool sweater that looked like it smelled of wet dog and cheap coffee. He held 2 steaming paper cups. He bumped his shoulder against Celine's. Adrian stopped breathing. The man said something. Celine looked up at him, and then it happened. Her face broke open. It wasn't a polite curving of the lips. It wasn't the tight, practiced half smile she used at his corporate galas, the one that never reached her eyes. This was a physical rupture. Her head threw back. Her shoulders shook. The olive trench coat slipped down a fraction as she laughed. A deep, full-bodied, ugly laugh. Her eyes crinkled into tight crescents. She reached out, her bare hand slapping the man's chest, leaning her weight into him, as if he were the only solid thing in a dissolving world. The man grinned, entirely unbothered by the rain, and handed her one of the cheap paper cups. Celine took it, wrapping both hands around the cardboard, lifting it to her face to inhale the steam. She looked up at the man again, and her expression softened into something Adrian felt like a physical blow to his sternum. It was absolute, unguarded warmth. A loud crack snapped Adrian back to the restaurant. The stem of his wine glass had snapped. Red liquid bled over his knuckles, dripping onto the pristine white tablecloth. Adrian, oh my God, are you all right? Daphne was dabbing at the table with a linen napkin, her face twisted in manicured panic. Adrian stared at his hand. The cut stung, a sharp, buzzing pain, but it felt miles away. He looked back out the window. The light had turned green. Celine and the man in the yellow beanie were crossing the street. The man had placed a large, clumsy hand on the small of her back. She wasn't pulling away. I need to go, Adrian said. The words tasted like copper. He didn't wait for Daphne to respond. He didn't wait for the check. He threw a stack of bills onto the ruined tablecloth, shoved his arms into his tailored overcoat, and pushed through the heavy mahogany doors into the damp, freezing night. Cold hit him like a slap. The street smelled of ozone, wet asphalt, and rotting garbage. He stood under the awning of the restaurant, the blood drying sticky and tight on his fingers, scanning the crowded sidewalk. They were gone, swallowed by the city. Adrian stood there while the valet hovered anxiously nearby. For 5 years, he had owned her time, her home, her name. He had given her a black card with no limit, a penthouse overlooking Central Park, and diamonds that felt like ice against her collarbone. He had given her everything. So why, in 5 God-forsaken years, had she never once smiled at him like that? Silence in the penthouse was absolute. It was a specific, heavy kind of silence that Adrian had designed and paid $3 million for. Soundproofed windows, thick, noise-canceling Persian rugs, polished marble floors that absorbed the vibrations of the city below. When he unlocked the door that night, the silence didn't feel luxurious. It felt like a vacuum. Adrian walked to the wet bar, pouring a glass of scotch he didn't want. He didn't bother turning on the lights. The ambient glow of the skyline filtered through the glass, casting long, warped shadows across the minimalist furniture. He sank into a leather armchair, the leather cold and unyielding against his back, and stared at the empty space where Celine's grand piano used to sit. He hadn't wanted her to take it. He didn't even play. But he had bought it for her, a Steinway, shiny and black. She had played it exactly 3 times. The scotch burned his throat, failing to melt the icy knot sitting heavy in his stomach. The image of her in the rain was branded onto the inside of his eyelids. The mustard beanie, the cheap coffee cup, the way she had leaned into the man's chest. Adrian's jaw tightened until his molars ached. He was Adrian Pendleton. He built acquisitions out of hostile takeovers. He stripped companies for parts and sold the marrow. He didn't lose. He calculated. But Celine was a ledger that refused to balance. He closed his eyes, and the sensory memories he usually kept, locked in a sterile mental vault, began to bleed out. He remembered their 2nd anniversary. He had booked a private dinner at a Michelin-starred place in Paris. He had surprised her with a necklace, a delicate chain of sapphires. When he clipped it around her neck, he remembered the exact temperature of her skin. It was clammy. She had looked at her reflection in the gilded mirror, her fingers brushing the stones. "It's beautiful, Adrian," she had said. Her voice was flat, carrying the mechanical cadence of an automated customer service line. She had given him that tight, practiced smile. The same smile she gave the doorman, the dry cleaner, the board members. He had felt a flicker of irritation back then. What more does she want, he had thought. I flew her to Paris. I bought her the ocean. He had mistaken her compliance for contentment. Adrian took another gulp of scotch. The alcohol was finally hitting his bloodstream, loosening the tight grip he kept on his own pride. He remembered the smell of the house when she lived here, not the expensive floral arrangements the staff brought in twice a week. No, the subtle, underlying scent of Celine. She smelled like unscented lotion and chamomile tea, a quiet, faded scent that seemed to apologize for taking up space in the air. He remembered the mornings, the routine. He would wake at 5 a.m., already checking emails. Celine would wake at 6:30. She would move around the bedroom like a ghost, terrified of making a sound. the soft shush-shush of her slippers on the marble floor, the gentle, apologetic click of the bathroom door. They rarely ate breakfast together. He was too busy. She was too quiet. When did the quiet turn into death? It wasn't a sudden explosion. There were no screaming matches, no shattered plates, no dramatic affairs. It was an erosion, a slow, agonizing rust. He remembered the day she asked for the divorce. It was a Tuesday, raining, just like tonight. She was sitting at the massive oak dining table, a table meant for 12 people, but it was just the two of them, sitting at opposite ends like rival monarchs. She hadn't yelled, she hadn't cried, she just pushed a manila folder across the polished wood. "I can't do this anymore, Adrian." He had been annoyed. He was late for a merger meeting. "Can't do what, Celine? Live in luxury? Never have to worry about a bill? What exactly are you suffering from?" She had looked at him, really looked at him. Her eyes, usually dull and compliant, held a profound, terrifying emptiness. "I am starving to death in a grocery store, Adrian," she had said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And you keep handing me receipts to prove I'm full." He hadn't understood it then. He had thought it was dramatic, ungrateful nonsense. He had signed the papers out of spite, fully expecting her to come crawling back when her savings ran out. When she realized how cold the real world was without his coat to shield her. 8 months. She hadn't called. She hadn't contested the prenup. She took her clothes, a few books, and the piano. Adrian threw his glass against the wall. The crystal shattered, a sharp, violent sound that finally broke the suffocating silence of the penthouse. Amber liquid wept down the expensive gray wallpaper. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving under his tailored shirt. He walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and pressed his forehead against the cold glass. The city pulsed below him, a grid of lights and lives he could buy and sell. But all he could see was that ugly olive trench coat. All he could hear was that laugh. He pulled out his phone. His thumb hovered over his contacts, scrolling down to the letter H. Harrison, his head of security, a man who found things out for a living. Adrian's finger hovered over the call button. He was crossing a line. He knew that. It was petty. It was pathetic. It was the desperate act of a man who realized someone else had unlocked a door he hadn't even known existed. He pressed call. "Mr. Pendleton," Harrison's rough voice answered on the second ring. "Harrison," Adrian said, his voice dropping into the cold, authoritative register he used to mask his own panic. "I need you to find someone. A man, late 30s, last seen near 54th and Lex." "Name, sir?" Adrian squeezed his eyes shut. "I don't know, but he's with my wife." "Your ex-wife, sir." "Just find him," Adrian snapped, hanging up the phone. Silence rushed back in, thicker than before. Adrian stood in the dark, the cut on his knuckles throbbing, realizing with a sickening drop in his gut that the 5 years they were married weren't a victory. They were a hostage situation, and he was the one left locked in the room. Files arrived on his desk at 10 a.m. 2 days later. Adrian had barely slept. He had spent 48 hours vibrating with a toxic cocktail of caffeine, wounded ego, and a strange gnawing anxiety that felt like a parasite chewing on his ribs. He sat in his corner office, the panoramic view of Manhattan sprawling behind him. A master of the universe reduced to glaring at a manila envelope. He ran his index finger over the clasp. The thick paper felt dry against his skin. He pulled the string. 3 photographs slid out, along with a single sheet of typed paper. Adrian picked up the photos. They were candid shots, taken by one of Harrison's discreet operatives. The first photo, the man in the mustard beanie. He was standing behind the counter of a small, cramped bookstore, laughing with a customer. The lighting was poor, but Adrian could see the details. A flannel shirt that had seen better days, a smudge of ink or dirt on his jaw. Deep laugh lines around his eyes. The second photo, Celine and the man. They were sitting on a park bench. They were sharing a pretzel, a stale, cheap street cart pretzel. Celine was holding a piece out to the man, her face scrunched up in mock disgust. The man was biting it right out of her hand. The third photo, the two of them walking down a residential street in Brooklyn. Not the glamorous, gentrified parts, a neighborhood with cracked sidewalks and overflowing trash cans. They were holding hands. Their fingers were interlaced tight, their shoulders bumping. Adrian dropped the photos onto his mahogany desk as if they were burning. He snatched up the typed paper. Subject, Leo Harding. Age, 38. Occupation, owner/operator of Dog-Eared Books, an independent used bookstore in Greenpoint, Brooklyn. Income, approximately $45,000 annually, struggling. Residency, rents a 1-bedroom walk-up above the bookstore. Vehicle, 2008 Honda Civic, heavily dented. Adrian read the paper 3 times. The words stopped making sense. $45,000. Adrian spent that much on bespoke suits in a single quarter, a used bookstore, a dented Honda. A sudden, sharp laugh punched its way out of Adrian's chest. It was a cruel, metallic sound. This was the man? This was the guy who had managed to pull a laugh from Celine's throat that Adrian couldn't buy with millions? A broke bookseller in a moldy apartment? Adrian stood up, pacing the length of his office. His mind, trained to find the weak point in any structure, frantically searched for the angle. Celine was playing a game. She had to be. This was her way of getting back at him. Slumming it, pretending to be happy with nothing, just to prove a point. It was a performance. It had to be. He stopped at the window, looking down at the yellow cabs crawling like beetles in the gridlock below. But that smile. The thought intruded, violent and sharp. That smile wasn't a performance. The way she had leaned into Leo Harding's chest. You couldn't fake that gravity. You couldn't buy that kind of surrender. Adrian needed to see it up close. He needed to prove to himself that it was a delusion, a trick of the rain and the streetlights. By 4 p.m., Adrian's black town car was idling silently across the street from Dog-Eared Books in Greenpoint. The neighborhood was offensively ordinary. The air smelled of exhaust fumes, stale beer from a nearby bodega, and frying onions. It lacked the sterile, filtered crispness of Adrian's world. The bookstore itself looked like a hazard. The paint on the sign was peeling. The windows were crammed with disorganized stacks of paperbacks. The bell above the door looked rusted. Adrian sat in the back of the car, the tinted windows hiding him from the street. The leather seat was buttery soft. The climate control was set to a perfect 70 degrees. Yet, he felt like he was suffocating. His collar felt like a noose. At 4:15 p.m., the rusted bell above the door jingled. Celine walked out. She wasn't wearing the olive trench coat. She was wearing a pair of worn-in jeans, real denim, not the designer stretch pants he used to buy her, and an oversized gray sweater that swallowed her frame. It looked like Leo's sweater. Her hair was pulled up in a messy bun, secured with a cheap plastic clip. Adrian's breath hitched. She looked smaller, messier, but she didn't look starved. Leo followed her out a second later. He was locking the door. Celine stood on the sidewalk, waiting. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled bag of something. She tossed a piece into her mouth. Leo turned around, slipping his keys into his pocket. He said something to her. Adrian rolled down his window just an inch. The sounds of the street flooded in, a siren blaring blocks away, the rumble of a passing truck. And then her voice. "I told you, it's not cheating if you don't know the rules," Celine said, her voice carrying a light, teasing lilt Adrian hadn't heard since they were in their 20s, before the money, before the coldness set in. "It's absolutely cheating," Leo laughed, stepping closer to her. He didn't hesitate. He didn't ask permission with his body language. He just wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her flush against him on the dirty Brooklyn sidewalk. Celine didn't flinch. She didn't stiffen her spine the way she used to when Adrian placed a proprietary hand on her lower back at galas. Instead, she melted. She wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face into the collar of his faded flannel shirt. Adrian watched as Leo buried his nose in her hair, pressing a long, slow kiss to her temple. The scent of cheap bodega coffee and damp pavement drifted through Adrian's cracked window. He watched his ex-wife, the woman he had adorned in diamonds and silk, stand on a filthy sidewalk wrapped in cheap cotton, radiating a profound, devastating peace. Adrian's chest tightened so violently, he thought he might be having a heart attack. The air left his lungs. The cynical defense mechanisms he had relied on his whole life crumbled into dust. He had thought she hated his money. He had thought she was ungrateful for the empire he had built for them. But sitting there in the dark of his town car, the truth hit him with the force of a physical blow, leaving him gasping and hollowed out. She hadn't starved because he didn't give her enough. She had starved because he had given her everything but himself. He had built a museum and demanded she be the exhibit. Leo Harding wasn't giving her anything Adrian couldn't afford. Leo was just giving her Leo. "Drive," Adrian choked out, his voice cracking, tearing at his throat. "Just drive." The town car pulled away, slipping seamlessly into the traffic, leaving Celine behind in the warm, messy reality Adrian could never buy his way into. He rolled the window up, sealing himself back in the quiet, perfect, freezing dark. Dry erase markers smelled like sharp chemical regret. Adrian sat at the head of the conference table, a slab of frosted glass that cost more than a starter home in the suburbs. Around him, 7 men in identical charcoal suits leaned forward, their faces illuminated by the harsh, blue glow of a PowerPoint presentation. The room was perfectly climate-controlled to 68 degrees. It kept people alert. It kept them slightly uncomfortable. Adrian had always liked it that way. "We bleed them out through the supply chain," Richard was saying. Richard was 32, wore his hair slicked back with something that smelled like peppermint and ambition, and had the moral compass of a starving shark. He tapped a laser pointer against a graph showing projected losses. "We cut off their secondary distributors. By Q3, they won't have the liquid capital to make payroll. They'll beg us to buy them for pennies on the dollar." Adrian stared at the red line on the graph plunging downward. Normally, this was the part of the meeting where the adrenaline hit, the kill shot, the moment the trap snapped shut. He built his entire identity on being the smartest, most ruthless man in the room. He was the apex predator in a jungle of glass and steel. Today, all he felt was a dull, thudding nausea. He looked at Richard's manicured hands. He looked at the other executives, all nodding in aggressive agreement, their eyes glassy with the prospect of year-end bonuses. "They'll beg us to buy them." Adrian closed his eyes, pressing the pads of his fingers against his temples. The dull ache that had taken up residence in his skull since Brooklyn pulsed in time with his heartbeat. When he closed his eyes, he didn't see market shares or profit margins. He saw a rusted bell above a bookstore door. He saw Celine, wrapped in oversized gray wool, tossing a piece of cheap candy into her mouth. He saw the way she had leaned into a man who couldn't afford to buy out a corner bodega, let alone a corporate rival. "Adrian?" Richard's voice broke through the hum of the air conditioner. "Thoughts on the Q3 squeeze?" Adrian opened his eyes. He looked at the men around the table. They looked like strangers. They looked like ghosts. "What happens to their employees?" Adrian asked. His voice sounded foreign, hollow, and quiet in the cavernous room. Silence dropped over the conference table like a lead weight. Richard lowered the laser pointer, a confused, tight smile twitching on his face. "The employees, sir?" Richard cleared his throat, adjusting his tie. "Well, standard restructuring protocols. We dissolve the redundancies. Middle management gets gutted, obviously. The floor workers—" "They lose their livelihoods," Adrian interrupted. It wasn't a question. Richard's smile vanished, replaced by the cautious, calculating look of a subordinate trying to figure out if this was a test. "Sir, it's a hostile takeover. Blood on the floor is part of the prospectus. We aren't running a charity. We're acquiring assets." "Acquiring assets?" Adrian looked down at his own hands. They were resting flat on the frosted glass, clean, uncalloused. A thin, pale scar ran across his knuckle where the wine glass had snapped days ago. He thought about his marriage. He hadn't courted Celine. He had acquired her. She had been a beautiful, quiet daughter of a failing real estate developer. Her family needed the cash injection. Adrian needed a wife who looked flawless at charity galas and didn't ask inconvenient questions. It was a merger, a flawless, bloodless merger. He had brought her into his penthouse, surrounded her with marble and silence, and slowly, systematically cut off her supply lines to the outside world. He hadn't meant to be cruel. He genuinely thought he was giving her an upgrade. He bought her better clothes, better food, better friends. He dissolved her redundancies, and she had starved. "Adrian?" The voice belonged to Greg, the CFO, an older man who rarely spoke unless money was actively burning. "Are you all right? You look pale." Adrian stood up. The heavy leather of his ergonomic chair sighed as the pressure was released. "Cancel the acquisition," he said. The room erupted into a chaotic, overlapping chorus of objections. Richard stood up, his face flushing dark red. "Cancel it? Adrian, we're 2 weeks out from the final push. We've spent 6 months backing them into a corner." "Then let them out of the corner," Adrian said softly. He grabbed his suit jacket from the back of the chair. It was a bespoke Tom Ford. It felt heavy. It felt like armor he didn't want to wear anymore. "You can't just walk away," Richard pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. "This is a $60 million deal." "Watch me." Adrian walked out of the boardroom. He didn't look back. He walked down the long, carpeted hallway ignoring the frantic footsteps of his assistant trailing behind him. He pushed through the heavy glass doors of the executive suite, stepped into the private elevator, and pressed the button for the lobby. The descent made his stomach drop. The polished metal doors reflected his image back to him. Dark hair, graying slightly at the temples, sharp jawline, expensive suit. He looked like a man who owned the world. He felt like a man who had absolutely nothing. He stepped out into the chaotic afternoon churn of Midtown Manhattan. The air was crisp, smelling of roasted nuts from a street cart and the metallic tang of subway exhaust. He didn't call his driver. He just started walking. He didn't know where he was going until he found himself standing outside a boutique on Fifth Avenue. The window display was stark white, featuring a single draped cashmere coat. The price tag wasn't visible. If you had to ask, you couldn't afford it. Adrian stared at the glass. He remembered the first year of their marriage. Celine had been wearing a ratty, oversized college sweatshirt around the penthouse. He had hated it. It looked messy. It looked out of place among the imported Italian leather furniture. He had called a personal shopper, handed over his black card, and told them to replace her entire casual wardrobe. When the boxes arrived, Celine had opened them silently. She had touched the fine, butter-soft cashmere, her face entirely unreadable. She never wore the college sweatshirt again. She wore the cashmere. She looked perfect. He had mistaken her obedience for gratitude. He pressed his hand against the cold glass of the boutique window. The cynical, armored shell he had worn his entire life was cracking, splitting open to reveal a soft, bruised underbelly he hadn't known he possessed. The realization tasted like bile and old pennies. He had spent 5 years trying to turn a living, breathing woman into a depreciating asset. And Leo Harding, a man who smelled like old paper and cheap coffee, had simply let her be a person. Rain turned the city into a gray-smeared canvas by Sunday morning. Adrian hated the rain. It ruined shoes and delayed flights. But today, it felt appropriate. He was standing in the cavernous, echoing hall of the Park Avenue Armory. The space, usually reserved for gala dinners or high-end art fairs, had been transformed into a labyrinth of wooden stalls and folding tables. It was the annual antiquarian book fair. It smelled like dust, decomposing leather, vanilla, and damp wool. It was a smell that made Adrian want to sneeze. He had no business being here. He didn't read fiction, and he certainly didn't collect old, moldy objects. His penthouse was aggressively modern, all glass, chrome, and negative space. But when he had woken up at 4 a.m., the suffocating silence of his bedroom pressing down on his chest, he had done something pathetic. He had looked up Leo Harding's business online. He had scrolled through the bookstore's meager social media presence, searching for a flaw, a crack, a reason to feel superior. Instead, he found a post from 3 days ago. A picture of Celine, holding a battered, leather-bound book, smiling at the camera. The caption read, "Hunting for treasure at the Armory this weekend. If you need us, follow the smell of decaying cellulose." So, Adrian was here, wearing a charcoal trench coat that cost more than a Honda Civic, stalking the aisles of old paper like a phantom. He told himself he was just curious. He told himself he wanted to see if they were actually happy, or if it was just a fleeting bohemian fantasy. Deep down, in the dark, honest corners of his mind, he knew the truth. He was hoping to catch them arguing. He was hoping the romantic veneer of poverty had worn off. He was hoping to see Celine looking tired, looking regretful, looking like she missed the easy, frictionless life he had provided. He navigated past a stall selling illuminated manuscripts from the 14th century, his eyes scanning the crowd. The people here were different from his usual circles. They wore tweed, thick glasses, and comfortable shoes. They moved slowly, reverently touching the merchandise. Then he saw her. She was standing at a booth tucked away in the back corner, an area dedicated to 19th century poetry. She was alone. Adrian's breath hitched, snagging in his throat. He stopped behind a display case of vintage globes, observing her. She was wearing a dark plum sweater that looked soft but slightly worn, paired with dark jeans and flat leather boots. Her hair was loose, tumbling over her shoulders in dark, natural waves. She was holding a small green book, her thumb gently tracing the gold foil lettering on the cover. She looked radiant. It wasn't the manufactured, polished radiance of a salon blowout and diamond earrings. It was an internal, quiet luminescence. She looked rested. She looked present. Adrian stepped out from behind the display case before his rational mind could stop his feet. The wooden floorboards creaked under his expensive Italian loafers. He stopped 2 feet away from her. The air between them suddenly felt impossibly thick, charged with the ghosts of 5 years of silence. "You never liked poetry," Adrian said. His voice was rougher than he intended, scraping out of his throat. Celine stiffened. The small, peaceful smile on her lips vanished instantly. For a fraction of a second, her shoulders hitched up toward her ears. The old, involuntary flinch she used to do whenever he walked into a room. It felt like a knife twisting in his ribs. She slowly closed the book and turned to face him. She didn't look terrified. She didn't look angry. She just looked incredibly, profoundly tired. "Adrian," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the teasing lilt he had heard outside the bookstore. It was the voice she used for the doorman. "What are you doing here?" "I was looking for a first edition," he lied, smoothly, automatically. "An investment piece." Celine looked at his pristine wool coat, his perfectly slicked hair, and then down at the worn green book in her hands. A small, sad huff of breath escaped her nose. It wasn't quite a laugh. "You don't collect books, Adrian. You collect trophies. This isn't your hunting ground." The blunt honesty shocked him. The old Celine, his Celine, would have nodded politely, offered a tight smile, and agreed with whatever lie he told. This Celine looked him dead in the eye and called his bluff. "People change, Celine," he said, stepping marginally closer. The scent of her, unscented lotion, chamomile, and now the faint smell of old paper wrapped around him. "No, they don't," she replied softly, setting the book back down on the table. "They just reveal more of who they always were." Adrian's jaw tightened. "Is that what you're doing? Revealing who you are? Slumming it in Brooklyn with a guy who smells like a thrift store?" The venom slipped out before he could filter it. It was a defense mechanism, a desperate attempt to regain the high ground. Celine didn't flinch this time. She just looked at him, her dark eyes filled with something that made Adrian's stomach curdle. It was pity. "He smells like life, Adrian," she said, her voice painfully gentle. "He smells like rain and coffee and dogs and reality. Do you know what you smell like?" Adrian didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat felt like it was closing. "You smell like dry cleaning fluid and cold air," she said. "You smell like an empty room." The words weren't yelled. They weren't delivered with malice. They were stated as a simple, tragic fact. They hit Adrian harder than a physical blow. He felt his perfectly constructed armor shatter, falling in jagged pieces around his feet. "I gave you everything," he whispered, the cynical billionaire reduced to a confused, wounded boy standing in a dusty hall. "I never denied you anything. You had the world." "I had a very expensive cage," Celine corrected him, stepping away from the table, putting an extra foot of distance between them. "I didn't want the world, Adrian. I just wanted someone to sit on the couch with me and eat cheap takeout without looking at their watch. I wanted someone to ask me how my day was and actually listen to the answer." She pulled her hands into the sleeves of her plum sweater, hugging herself slightly. "You didn't love me. You loved the idea of having a wife who fit perfectly into the empty spaces of your life, like a custom piece of furniture." Adrian opened his mouth to argue, to deploy his usual rapid-fire logic, to dismantle her argument point by point. But he had nothing, because she was right. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and realized he didn't know her favorite color. He didn't know what music she listened to when she was alone. He only knew how she took her coffee because his assistant ordered it for her. Celine. The name felt clumsy on his tongue, heavy with unearned intimacy. "Hey, found it." The voice came from Adrian's left. Leo Harding walked up, holding a battered paperback. He was wearing a faded corduroy jacket over a Henley shirt. His hair was messy, sticking up slightly in the back. He looked completely, utterly unremarkable, until he looked at Celine. Leo's eyes crinkled at the corners. He didn't even notice Adrian at first. All of his attention, all of his gravity was pulled toward the woman in the plum sweater. He stepped into her personal space, casually bumping his shoulder against hers, a gesture of such easy, unforced intimacy that Adrian felt physically sick. "The 1928 print," Leo said, holding up the book. "Missing the dust jacket, and some idiot spilled tea on chapter 4, but it's structurally sound." Celine's entire posture shifted. The defensive rigidity melted away. Her shoulders dropped. She leaned into the bump, turning her face toward Leo. And there it was again, the smile, soft, unguarded, blindingly warm. "You found it," she breathed, reaching out to touch the stained cover. "You actually dug through those boxes." "I braved the silverfish for you," Leo grinned. He finally turned his head, registering the tall, rigid man standing 2 feet away. The smile on Leo's face didn't falter, but it shifted. It went from intimate to polite. He looked at Adrian's expensive coat, his tailored suit, his polished shoes. He didn't look intimidated. He just looked mildly curious. "Oh," Leo said, extending a hand that was slightly rough and stained with old ink. "Hi, I'm Leo." Adrian stared at the hand. He was Adrian Pendleton. He destroyed men like this before breakfast. He could buy this entire building, evict every vendor, and burn the books just to watch the smoke. He had the power of a god in the financial district. But standing here in the smell of dust and vanilla, looking at the way Celine's arm lightly brushed against Leo's side, Adrian realized he had absolutely no power at all. Slowly, feeling like his joints were rusted shut, Adrian reached out and shook Leo's hand. "Adrian," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Leo's eyebrows ticked up a fraction of an inch. He realized exactly who he was looking at. The easy posture remained, but his grip tightened just a little, a quiet, subtle statement of presence. He didn't pull Celine closer. He didn't need to. Nice to meet you, Adrian, Leo said, his voice perfectly even. He let go of Adrian's hand and turned back to Celine. Ready to get out of here? The rain is letting up. We can hit that diner on 3rd for pancakes. Yeah, Celine said, not looking at Adrian. Pancakes sound perfect. Adrian stood frozen as they walked away. He watched the corduroy jacket and the plum sweater disappear into the crowd of tweed and wool. He listened to the hum of the antique fair, the rustle of turning pages, the murmur of bartering voices. He stood there for a long time, entirely alone, surrounded by artifacts of the past, realizing he was just another ghost haunting the aisles. Monday morning arrived with the sterile, unforgiving efficiency Adrian used to worship. Sunlight pierced the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, cutting sharp geometric angles across the imported mahogany desk. The air smelled of ozone from the heavy-duty printers and the faint, bitter tang of espresso his assistant had left on a coaster precisely 2 inches from his keyboard. It was the smell of power. It was the smell of control. Adrian hated it. He sat in his ergonomic chair, staring at a leather-bound checkbook. The thick, creamy paper was watermarked with the insignia of a private wealth management firm that required an 8-figure minimum balance just to open an account. He picked up his pen. It was a heavy, custom-weighted fountain pen that rested perfectly in the webbing of his hand. He unscrewed the cap. The gold nib hovered over the date line. What was the going rate for a human soul? He dragged the nib across the paper. He wrote Celine's name. His handwriting was aggressive, sharp spikes and heavy pressure that left an indentation on the carbon copy beneath. He moved to the amount line. He wrote a 1, then a 0, then another. He kept adding zeros until the number was absurd, obscene, a figure that could buy Leo Harding's decaying bookstore 20 times over, bulldoze the block, and build a luxury high-rise in its place. He stared at the ink as it dried. In his world, this was how you fixed a miscalculation. You paid the penalty, you smoothed over the friction with liquid capital, and you moved forward. It was an apology written in the only language he had ever bothered to learn. If he gave her this, she wouldn't have to live in a cramped apartment that smelled of frying onions. She wouldn't have to wear thrift store wool. She could have her freedom, but she could have it on his terms. He would still be the provider. He would still retain a sliver of the control. Adrian tore the check from the binding. The sound of ripping paper was loud like a gunshot in the silent office. He folded it twice, sliding it into a crisp white envelope. He didn't write a note. He didn't know what to say. Sorry I treated you like a fixture? Sorry I didn't know you liked cheap pretzels? By noon, his town car was idling on the corner of 54th and Lexington, the same corner where the rain had washed away 5 years of willful blindness. He told the driver to head to Greenpoint. The drive over the bridge felt like crossing a border into a hostile country. The glass towers of Manhattan faded in the rearview mirror, replaced by the squat brick reality of Brooklyn. The car pulled to a stop halfway down the block from dog-eared books. Adrian stepped out. He told the driver not to wait. He needed to walk. He needed to feel the pavement beneath his shoes. The air here was different. It wasn't filtered. It smelled of exhaust, damp concrete, and the sickly sweet scent of garbage baking in the afternoon sun. He walked toward the bookstore, his hand in his coat pocket, his fingers curled tightly around the envelope. The rusted bell chimed as he pushed the door open. The smell of decomposing paper and vanilla hit him instantly, an invisible wall of scent that made his chest tighten. The shop was empty of customers. Dust motes danced lazily in a single shaft of sunlight, cutting through the grimy front window. Leo Harding was behind the counter. He was wearing a faded denim shirt, his sleeves rolled up to the elbows, exposing forearms dusted with light hair and a smear of blue ink near his wrist. He was carefully taping the spine of a battered hardcover. Leo didn't look up immediately. He finished pressing the tape down, his thumb smoothing the edge with practiced, gentle precision. Only then did he lift his head. His eyes locked onto Adrian. There was no surprise. There was no intimidation. "Adrian," Leo said, his voice a low, even rumble that carried no threat, but no welcome either. "Leo." Adrian walked toward the counter. The wooden floorboards creaked under his weight. He stopped a few feet away, absorbing the clutter of the space. Stacks of books leaned precariously against each other. A half-eaten sandwich sat on a paper plate next to the register. It was chaotic. It was messy. It was everything Adrian despised. Adrian pulled his hand from his pocket and dropped the crisp white envelope onto the counter. It landed with a soft, dismissive thud next to Leo's roll of tape. Leo looked down at it. He didn't reach for it. "What's this?" "A severance," Adrian said, his voice slipping into the cold, authoritative cadence of the boardroom. "Or a settlement. Call it whatever makes you comfortable. It's for Celine." Leo leaned back against the shelves behind him, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked at Adrian not with anger, but with a profound, terrifying pity. It was the exact same look Celine had given him at the armory. "She has an attorney for the divorce settlement," Leo said quietly. "If this is paperwork, mail it to him." "It's not paperwork," Adrian said, his jaw tightening. "It's money. Enough money so she doesn't have to live above a fire hazard and wear someone else's old clothes. Enough so she doesn't have to pretend she likes this squalor just to spite me." Leo let out a heavy breath, shaking his head. He reached out and pushed the envelope back across the scratched wood of the counter, stopping when it bumped against Adrian's knuckles. "She doesn't want it, man." "You haven't even looked at the number," Adrian snapped, the control slipping, a sharp edge of desperation bleeding into his voice. "Don't make decisions for her. That's exactly what you think I did, isn't it? Let her decide." "I don't make decisions for her," Leo said, his voice remaining agonizingly calm. "I just know her, and I know she left that life because it was suffocating her. Pushing a pile of cash across a counter isn't an apology, Adrian. It's a receipt. It's you trying to buy back your own conscience." Adrian stared at the man, his heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. He wanted to punch Leo. He wanted to reach across the counter and grab him by the collar of his cheap denim shirt and throw him against the shelves. He wanted to prove he was stronger, better, more capable, but violence wouldn't change the truth. "How do you do it?" Adrian asked. The question tore its way out of his throat, raw and unpolished. The boardroom armor cracked, shattering into pieces on the dusty floorboards. Leo uncrossed his arms. He rested his hands flat on the counter. "Do what?" "Make her smile," Adrian whispered, the words tasting like ash. "In 5 years, she never looked at me the way she looked at you in the rain. Never. I gave her the world. I gave her a life with no friction, no worry. I solved every problem before it even reached her. And she looked at me like I was a warden." Leo was silent for a long time. The ambient hum of traffic outside seemed to swell, filling the space between them. "You solved her problems, Leo said slowly. "But you never let her have any. You built a museum around her, Adrian. A climate-controlled box where nothing changes, nothing breaks, and nothing breathes." Leo picked up the book he had been repairing. He ran his thumb over the freshly taped spine. People need friction. They need mess. They need to drop a plate and clean it up. They need to get caught in the rain and laugh because it sucks. You tried to protect her from life, but you just isolated her from it. I don't buy her things. I don't solve her problems. I just sit with her in the mess. Adrian looked down at the envelope. The white paper looked glaringly artificial against the worn, stained wood of the counter. "She likes her coffee black," Leo said softly, an offering of a truth Adrian had never bothered to learn. "Not with almond milk and a single sugar. She only drank that because your assistant kept ordering it, and she didn't want to be an inconvenience." The words felt like a physical blow to Adrian's sternum. He didn't know that. 5 years, thousands of mornings, and he didn't know how his own wife drank her coffee. He had been so busy managing her existence that he had entirely missed who she was. Adrian picked up the envelope. It felt heavier now. The millions of dollars inside felt entirely worthless. It was a currency that held no exchange rate in this room. "Keep the envelope out of her sight," Adrian said, his voice thick, rough. He didn't look at Leo. He just turned his back, staring at the dust motes dancing in the sunlight. Tell her I'm sorry about the coffee." He didn't wait for a response. He walked to the door, pulled it open, and stepped out into the humid, exhaust-choked air of Brooklyn. The bell jingled behind him, a final, tinny punctuation mark on a 5-year mistake. He didn't call his driver. He walked to the corner, found a rusted trash can overflowing with discarded coffee cups and bodega wrappers. He tore the envelope in half, then in quarters. He dropped the shredded pieces of a $10 million check into the garbage. Winter arrived in New York with a brutal, biting cruelty. The wind whipped off the East River, turning the streets into wind tunnels that stripped the warmth from your bones in seconds. Adrian stood by the window of a 2-bedroom apartment in Chelsea. It wasn't a penthouse. It didn't have soundproofed walls or imported marble floors. He could hear the heavy footsteps of the tenant above him. He could hear the radiator clanking and hissing in the corner, a persistent metallic rhythm that annoyed him at first, but now felt oddly comforting. It sounded alive. He held a ceramic mug in his hand. It wasn't bone china. It was thick, slightly chipped at the rim, bought from a corner hardware store. He brought it to his lips and took a sip. Black coffee. It tasted bitter. It tasted aggressive. It burned the back of his throat. He hated it, but he drank it anyway. The massive corner office overlooking Midtown belonged to Richard now. Adrian had stepped down as CEO 3 months ago. The board had been shocked, scrambling to offer him more stock options, more vacation time, more control. They didn't understand that control was the very thing he was trying to amputate. He still sat on the board. He still had more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. He hadn't undergone some miraculous cinematic transformation into a monk. He was still Adrian Pendleton. He still liked expensive suits and fine wine. But the silence had changed. He walked away from the window, the floorboards groaning slightly beneath his weight. He set the mug down on a small wooden dining table. There was no grand piano in this apartment. There was just empty space. He pulled on his overcoat, a dark, heavy wool that wasn't bespoke, just warm. He wrapped a scarf around his neck and walked out into the hallway, locking the door behind him. The street was chaotic. Taxis honked, slipping on patches of black ice. Pedestrians huddled into their collars, rushing toward the warmth of the subway grates. Adrian joined the flow of traffic on the sidewalk. He didn't have a destination. He was just walking. He thought about Celine. The sharp, agonizing pain of her absence had dulled into a persistent, heavy ache, like an old bone break that acts up when the weather turns cold. He didn't stalk her social media anymore. He didn't send Harrison to check on her. He let her go. He finally unlatched the door of the cage and walked away from it. A sudden, sharp gust of wind caught him at an intersection. It ripped a paper flyer from a nearby telephone pole, sending it fluttering into his chest. At the same moment, the sky broke open. It wasn't snow. It was freezing, miserable, sleety rain. The kind that instantly soaked through wool and froze your skin. People around him cursed, popping open black umbrellas, diving under awnings of closed delis. Adrian stood on the corner of the intersection. The icy water hit his face, plastering his graying hair to his forehead. The cold seeped through the shoulders of his coat, chilling him to the bone. A cab pulled up to the curb, splashing a wave of slushy gray water over Adrian's leather shoes. The driver rolled down the window, yelling something unintelligible over the sound of the storm. Adrian looked down at his ruined shoes. He looked at the gray water soaking into the leather. 5 years ago, he would have fired an assistant over this. He would have raged at the indignity of the city touching him. He reached up, wiping the freezing rain from his eyes. He took a deep breath, inhaling the sharp, metallic scent of the wet asphalt, the exhaust of the idling cab, the raw, unfiltered smell of a world he couldn't control. Slowly, involuntarily, the corner of Adrian's mouth twitched. It felt strange. It felt uncomfortable. The muscles in his face had to stretch in unfamiliar ways. He threw his head back, letting the freezing rain hit his face directly, and for the first time in his meticulously curated, flawlessly executed life, Adrian Pendleton stood in the mess. And he smiled. Stories like Adrian's remind us that perfection is often just a beautifully decorated cage, and true connection lives in the messy, unscripted moments of life. If this story moved you, please drop a comment and tell us what you think Adrian's next chapter looks like. Don't forget to hit the like button, share this video with a friend who loves deep storytelling, and subscribe for more.